Thank you for joining us for our third Records Roundup, Birth, Marriage, and Death, Vital Records in the Archives. My name is Stacy Hutchison, and today Maureen Iplensky and I will be highlighting the vital records found at the archives. Then Jessie Poole-Gulick and Hillary Brown from the Coroner's office will be joining us to share more about that row office and how it has started and changed over time. Before we get started, I want to remind you that there's still time to join the Chester County History Center's Plagues and Pestilence walking tour, and don't miss out on next month's Chilling Westchester, which shares true tales of murder, mischief, and misadventure. If you're a fan of walking tours or of history programs, consider gifting yourself or a loved one with a Chester County History Center membership. Membership offers VIP access to events and provides free or discounted entry to most of CCHC's exciting programs. At the end of the program, we will be sharing a link to a feedback form. Please take a few moments to complete it. It will help us to plan for next year's programming. Finally, if you have any questions during this program, please put them in the chat box and we'll do our best to answer them at the end. Before we focus on the records, I would like to share a little bit about the Chester County Archives. The history of the Chester County Archives begins in 1982, the year of the county's tricentennial, when a partnership was established between the County of Chester and the Chester County Historical Society, which is now known as the Chester County History Center. The goal of this partnership was, and continues to be, to preserve and make available the historic records of the Chester County government. Currently located at the Government Services Center in Westchester, the Chester County Archives holds over 3,500 cubic feet of original public records, of which 40% has been digitized. It is important to note that county records are collected and maintained following Pennsylvania state law, which means that county governments did not create and keep records unless they were mandated to do so. For many years now, the archives has offered access to our online indexes and to our digital collections for those researchers who were able to visit our research room. For any of you who made the trek to Westchester, you may remember that both the digitized images and the indexes were arranged by subject, just as the records, guides, and indexes are on our website, as you see here. However, you can now access the archive scans of these historic records right from the archives website, and Maureen will demonstrate how to do this later in the program. Today, though, we're going to focus on birth, marriage, and death records. Some of the most commonly asked questions that we receive at the archives relate to vital records, or records that mark central life events, such as births, deaths, and marriages. However, until the mid-19th century, the creation and preservation of vital records was not a function of government, but rather came under the purview of an individual's faith community. Although the county's vital records may not be as extensive as many researchers would hope, many county records do record vital information. And today, we will be highlighting the archive's vital records, as well as those records where this vital information can often be found. I will cover birth and marriage records, while Maureen will share about the archive's death-related records. In 1852, Pennsylvania passed a law for the registration of marriages, births, and deaths. The reason for passing Act 2 is cited within the text. Because it was difficult to prove marriages, births, and deaths, the rights of many had been sacrificed, and great wrongs have been done. Not only did the 1852 law explain why it was passed, but it also outlined what information was to be documented, who was to gather the information, and how it was to be collected. The first vital records that you can find at the archives are birth and death records. Birth and death records are each comprised of two separate records, a birth or death return and a birth or death register, where the returns information was entered. As you can see, this was a short-lived attempt that lasted for only 3 years. Let's explore these records to understand why. The 1852 law directed members of the clergy or physicians to create, keep, and return vital records to the county's Register of Wills. As you can imagine, documentation may not have been a top priority for a professional like a doctor. However, despite their short duration, birth returns provide specific genealogical information for researchers. This example of a birth return shows that baby boy Harmon was born at 4 a.m. on Sunday, May 7th, 1854, to Jeremiah and Julianne George Harmon. We also learned that Jeremiah Harmon was a trader and that baby Harmon was the couple's first son after having 2 daughters, whose names were Mary Elizabeth and Anna. This is information that we would hope to find in a vital record. But there is one other field on the birth return that may provide great information for researchers, and it's the memoranda field, which, in this case, reveals that Jeremiah Harmon had been married before, and from that marriage, there was a living daughter named Sarah, and her mother's name was Eliza Bayard. When the return was submitted to the Register of Wills office, the law directed that the Register of Wills record the information in a register that was to be provided to them. On the left is the entry for baby boy Harmon, and we see that the information from the birth return, shown on the last slide, has been entered into the registration of births. Since these records depended on professionals to gather the data, they are not a complete set of records, nor was the practice widely adopted. So in 1855, the law was repealed. 38 years later, in 1893, another attempt was made, and the onus was to gather birth and death-related information passed from the clergy and physicians to tax assessors. While this method lasted for 10 more years than the first attempt, there was an inherent delay between the time of a birth or a death and when it was recorded in the registers by the orphans' court. The upper left corner shows an example of the page in the birth register that records Dr. Charlotte Moore Sitterly's birth. Dr. Sitterly was born as Charlotte Moore on September 24, 1898 in Ursheldon, Pennsylvania, where a PHMC marker has been installed to recognize her work in astronomy and physics. A closer look at Charlotte Moore's register entry not only shows that her birth was recorded 3 months after the event, but if you look more closely, you can see that a mistake in transcription was made, because the name of mother for both George Martin and Charlotte Moore is recorded as Lizzie Moore. The final iteration of birth and death records came in 1906, when the state created the Central Bureau of Vital Statistics to issue birth and death certificates as it continues to do today. This means that any requests for these documents are filled by the state government in Harrisburg. There is one other record relating to birth that was mandated by the state, and it's the delayed birth certificate. This record was designed for those who were born in Pennsylvania before 1906 who did not have a birth record, or it was incomplete, or it was incorrect. Accurate proof of birth became vitally important for those who were eligible to receive Social Security benefits when they were introduced in the 1930s. This is an example of an application for a delayed birth certificate for Leah Beatrice Mowry that was issued to correct her original one. The birth register had indicated that Leah was born male, hence the reason for the delayed birth certificate. Not only did the clerk note the delayed birth certificate number in the original register, but the file also contains a reissued certificate of baptism, which adds additional genealogical value for researchers. In addition to including faith-related records, those applying for delayed birth certificate might also include documentation from a family Bible, or even a life insurance policy, as did Harry Roy Burgoyne of Spring City, whose application was filed just 10 days before his 52nd birthday. In addition to birth records, where else can you locate birth-related information? If you know that your ancestors were affiliated with a particular faith community, then a good place to start is to determine where the congregation's records went. As we saw with the birth return for baby boy Harmon, be sure to double-check siblings and even step-siblings. Perhaps an unexpected source of birth-related information can be found in tavern petitions that were submitted after 1887, because anyone applying for a tavern license was asked to list a place of birth or a date and place of naturalization. Next, we'll explore guardianship records. Then we'll look for information about births in poorhouse and poor school children records. And finally, we'll explore tax records when we look at marriage records. Guardianship and estate matters are handled by Chester County's Orphans Court. Orphans Court is a county court, and the name of this court causes some confusion for researchers and raises the question, who is an orphan? The term orphan was used to mean fatherless, and it was not uncommon for a mother to petition to have a guardian appointed for her orphaned minor-aged children. Anyone under the age of 21 was considered a minor. However, children under the age of 21 but over the age of 14 could choose their own guardians. For any Jane Austen fans in the audience, you may remember that Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam were appointed as guardians to Georgiana Darcy. Although we didn't have any records for the Darcy family, we did locate an Orphans Court minors file for an Elizabeth Bennet, who at the age of 16 petitioned to choose her own guardian. Familiarity with these terms and checking this record group may help you to estimate birth years if an ancestor lost a father as a minor. On the opposite side of the socioeconomic scale, poorhouse records may also record information about an ancestor's age or birth. Admission books to the poorhouse were used to keep track of individuals staying in the poorhouse, and they include details such as name, age, date of admittance, place they came in from, as well as information about babies born in the home. Here we see that Susan Ford returned to the poorhouse in August of 1822 with her child who had been born in the house on May 23rd, 1821. In 1809, Pennsylvania passed a law that required the county to identify all those families with children between the ages of 5 and 12 who could not pay for their schooling. It did not require children to attend school, and it did not establish a separate poor school for these children. Essentially, it was to allow children who were interested, eligible, and able to attend their local subscription school. The law required the tax assessors to identify these families and then submit the names to the commissioners who wrote them down into an account book. Here we see that Jesse and Mary Mercer from Goshen had 3 children, Hiram, Hannah, and Jefferson. Remember that only children between the ages of 5 and 12 will be included, so the Mercers may have had other children who were either too old or too young to be eligible. County marriage records began in 1852 with the same vital records law that was repealed in 1855. 30 years later, in 1885, another law was passed, and the issuing of marriage licenses became a function of the county, as it still is today. If you are looking for a marriage record filed before 1931, then you can find it at the Chester County Archives. After 1931, researchers need to contact the Orphans Court. Like the birth returns, marriage returns can yield some helpful information. In this example, it is recorded that the bride, Hannah Culp, was a widow, and that we learn that her surname at birth was Reed. Finally, we see that the marriage ceremony was German Reformed, which points you to additional faith-related records. Like the birth returns, the completed return of marriage was returned to the county's Register of Wills and entered into the register. The upper left quadrant is a transcription of the information recorded on the return of marriage for Peter Danfield and Hannah Culp that was shown on the last slide. In 1855, the law was repealed, which means that we have no marriage records until that next law was enacted 30 years later. The 1885 law required couples to apply to an orphans court, but the application and the return or the duplicate certificate that proved that a marriage took place could be filed anywhere in Pennsylvania. This is an example of a marriage application for Dr. Barber and his wife, Marguerite, who are the parents of the famous composer Samuel Barber, who grew up in Westchester. As with other vital records, marriage records were kept by the faith communities throughout Chester County. Divorce papers require proof of marriage, and the archives houses divorce records until 1902. After 1902, divorce papers remain at the prothonotary office. We'll turn next to probate records, then we'll look at deeds and taxes to see how they can reveal marriage-related information. One of the archive's most popular resources is probate, estate, and settlement records because they reveal relationships, residences, marriages, and children. The Chester County Archives preserves almost 40,000 wills, but only those Chester County decedents with enough property to warrant the probate process will be represented in the collection. This will, written by Catherine Booth, is an incredible example of how much birth and marriage information can be found in a will. There are 2 versions of Catherine Booth's will shown here, the original handwritten one, as well as a typed abstract. In her will, Catherine Booth recounts much of her life story, sharing in 1803, after 14 years of marriage, her husband Walter died, leaving her a widow with 8 children, all under the age of 13, the youngest of whom was a baby, not more than 4 months old. Furthermore, Catherine listed the names of her 5 daughters right there with their husbands. Land records are another potential source of marriage information for researchers. County land records or deeds are housed at the archives or at the Recorder of Deeds office and are contracts in which one citizen conveys land to another. While deeds look different from one another, there are 3 distinct parts found in every deed: the introduction, the physical description, and the recital clause. An introduction to a deed provides information about the people involved in the transaction, including the spouses of grantors. To protect dower rights, Pennsylvania passed a law stipulating that spouses of grantors or sellers must agree to any sale of real estate. Here we see Richard Wade and his wife sold the property to Harry A. Spriggs. We also learned that Richard Wade's wife's name was Constance Elaine Wade, and that both parties were from Westchester. Another part of the deed that may contain genealogical information is the recital clause, which tells the history of the property. This recital clause is filled with information about the artist Horace Pippin and his wife, Jenny Ora Giles Pippin. We learn that Jenny Ora Giles purchased the property before she was married to Horace Pippin. We learn that Horace and Jenny died 2 weeks apart from one another in July of 1946. And we learn that Jenny had been previously married and that her son from this marriage is the grantor or the seller, Richard Wade. Taxes. Taxes are a part of our life just as they were for Chester Countyans in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Tax records, like census records, situate a vast majority of individuals in a specific place at a specific time. But unlike the federal census, taxes were collected yearly, so they can be quite useful. Understanding tax categories may enable you to use the tax records to estimate a birth date or narrow down a marriage date. The first category is landholders. It is important to note that the term used is landholder and not landowner, because the tax was assessed to the person who was seated on the property. If you were not a landholder and you were a male over the age of 21, then you were assessed a head tax or a poll tax. Your rate was determined by your marital status. If you were married or widowed, you were referred to as an inmate. And if you were single, you were a freeman. Sadly, persons of color and women were generally not taxable inhabitants. So researchers will find inconsistencies in these records. This is the 1757 tax rate for East Nottingham Township, and it illustrates the different categories that I had just mentioned. The first column is the landholder. The second column lists inmates, and the third column lists freemen. You can also observe that the tax rate for the inmates is consistently less than that for freemen. So there was a financial inducement for people to marry. Sometimes you might find a record that contains marriage and birth and death information, like a naturalization record. Chester County begins recording naturalization records in 1798. That's the first recorded naturalization record that we have. This process created 2 records, the Declaration of Intention and the Petition to Naturalize. In 1906, the Federal Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization was established, thereby regulating the process and creating forms that required more descriptive information. Here we see both the Declaration of Intention and the petition to naturalize for John Kirk Sr. of Glasgow, Scotland. We learn that in 1931, when he filed his Declaration of Intention, he lived with his family at 104 6th Street in Coatesville. The Declaration records the names and birth dates of his 4 children, the name and birth date of his wife, Martha Anderson Kirk, as well as their marriage date. By 1934, when John Kirk Sr. submitted his petition for citizenship, we learn that he was a widower because Martha had died on June 20th, 1933, and that only William continued to reside with him. So this naturalization not only provided birth and marriage information, but also records the date of Martha's death. I hope that you can see that birth and marriage information can be located in various sources at the archives. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Maureen, who will share more about death and death-related records that you can find at the archives. It will just take a moment for her presentation to begin.
Thank you, Stacy. So I will share my screen now. All right. Thank you. So I'm Maureen Iplensky, the Assistant Archivist, and as Stacy mentioned, I'll go over some of the death-related records that we have here in the archives. So before I dig into those records, I just want to quickly share how you can access those records through our website. So first, you will need to visit the archives website at chesco.org, and then by hovering over the Government tab at the top of the page, and by clicking Archives and Records listed under County Departments, you will be sent to our homepage, and all of our index collections are listed here on our Records, Guides, and Indexes page. So our vital records, which include our birth, marriage, and death records, are available here. And our vital records are indexed by record type and organized alphabetically. So if you are searching for a specific family member or ancestor, you can search them through each record group. For steps on how to navigate our indexes in digital collections site, I invite you to watch our Guide to Digital Access tutorial video, which is available on the archive's YouTube page. And we also have a step-by-step guide, which is available on our Records, Guides, and Indexes page. So now let's talk about our death records. These records span from 1852 to 1906, and they include death returns, a register, and proof of death register. After 1906, the state of Pennsylvania began to issue death certificates. So to access death records that were filed after 1906, researchers need to contact the Pennsylvania Division of Vital Records. Deaths similar to births and marriages were not recorded until 1852, when Pennsylvania passed the Registration Act. As Stacy mentioned, this act was very short-lived. Throughout the act's term, only a few hundred deaths were ever recorded in the county, and there are even a few handful of townships that only submitted a few returns to the Register of Wills. For instance, only one death return from East Cowan Township was ever submitted. As this map shows, deaths for residents in and around Westchester were more likely to be reported to the Register of Wills. Over 100 of these returns were for deaths in Westchester, but as you can see, all of the other townships reported less than 30 deaths throughout this time period. However, the death returns that were filed include valuable information about the lives and the deaths of county residents. For instance, this return for Hannah Hodgson of East Nottingham Township shows that Hannah was the daughter of Abel and Elizabeth Hodgson. She was born in East Nottingham in either the autumn of 1768 or the spring of 1769. She died on July 26, 1853, in her 85th year, and she was buried in Sharp's Burial Ground in Cecil County, Maryland. The Registration Act also required the Register of Wills to maintain a register of county deaths, and this is the entry for Hannah Hodgson. Again, it shows that she died on July 26, 1853. After the repeal of the Registration Act, counties were not required to record deaths for another 20 years. In 1874, the General Assembly passed an act that required those who applied to letters of administration to file with the Register of Wills an affidavit setting forth the day and hour of the decedent's death. In other words, if a resident died intestate or without a will, a relative needed to submit a proof of death with the Register of Wills before they could settle the deceased person's estate. In this instance, Samuel Ortlip filed this affidavit for the death of Margaret Ortlip of Upper Oxford Township. She died at the residence of Marshall Ortlip on August 8, 1879, and beginning in 1893, these affidavits were filed with the deceased person's estate. From 1893 to 1906, deaths were recorded by the tax assessor and then reported to the county. Consequently, as Stacy mentioned, births and deaths during this period were often not reported until months after the event occurred. For example, John C. Brock died on August 19, 1901, but his death was not recorded by the county until December of 1901. This register shares that Brock was born in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and worked as a clergyman. He died in Westchester at the young age of 58 years old. He suffered from a combination of illnesses for a year prior to his death and was buried at the Chestnut Grove Cemetery. For residents who died as a minor, which included those under the age of 21, the death register also identifies their parents in the final column. Death records, as we have seen, detail more than a person's death. They can be used to identify a spouse or a parent and often include information about a person's birth. While these records may be useful when researching a relative who died in the late 1800s or early 1900s, there, of course, is a noticeable gap in these records. So what do you do if your ancestor died before 1852? Well, you can look outside the county archives. Deaths are often recorded by churches. For instance, this is the burial record for Margaret Ortlip, which is held at the Presbyterian Historical Society. So if you can identify an ancestor's faith community, you may be able to find records related to their life and an archive related to that religion, or with the church if that church is still in existence. Deaths are also often recorded in newspapers, such as this obituary for John C. Brock, which was published in the Daily Local News. There are also many other county records that may document death. For instance, the archives maintain cemetery records cemetery cards for veterans. Included in this collection are veterans and their widows whose burials were financed by the county. Brock's cemetery card lists his date of death, and his place of burial. The poorhouse admission book also identifies those who died during their time at the poorhouse. Occasionally, the admission book also includes burial information. For instance, this entry shows that John Harlan of Bradford died on July 11, 1825, and was taken by his friends to be buried at Kennet. And because wills describe the settling of one's estate following their death, they may also be used to determine when a resident passed. Lastly, commissioners also granted tax discounts to those who recently died, as in this instance. Reported as dead in 1809, Joseph Darlington was of course excused from the county taxes. And the last collection that I'll mention today related to death are our coroner records. So if a resident died of an unnatural, suspicious, or unknown cause, then their death may be recorded by the county coroner. Our collection of coroner records include reports, dockets, bills, and quarter session inquests. These records go as far back as 1720 and end in 1957. For coroner's records after 1957, researchers need to contact the coroner's office directly. Similar to our vital records, you may access our coroner records by visiting our Records, Guides, and Indexes page, then click the link to our coroner's records. Here you may access our indexes and images of these records. So before we dig into each specific document, this is just a brief overview of our collection. The coroner's reports are created during a coroner's inquisition. Dockets include brief accounts of investigations. Bills include a list of expenses, which are submitted to the commissioners for reimbursement. And the quarter session inquest detail investigations conducted by the Justice of the Peace. So this is the coroner's docket for William Highland, showing that the coroner investigated the cause of his death on October 6, 1904 in Phoenixville. The docket identifies witnesses and lists his cause of death as an electric shock while employed as a lineman with the Schuylkill Valley Illuminating Company. The docket is signed by the deputy coroner, and while the docket provides a brief account, coroner reports are often more detailed. In this instance, it shares that the inquest was done at Highland's home, and the coroner again attributed his death to an electric shock, but emphasized that the accident was due to Highland's own carelessness and that the company was therefore exonerated. For each case, the coroner also sent a bill to the county commissioners for reimbursement. Included are the costs of the inquest, along with the date and cause of death. By 1841, the coroner was not the only county official who oversaw these investigations. That year, the Pennsylvania General Assembly passed an act that allowed justices of the peace to lead inquests when there was no county coroner or if the coroner was unavailable. The cost of these inquests, such as the costs listed on this bill, would not be reimbursed until proceedings of their case were submitted to the Court of Quarter Sessions. This quarter session docket from 1844 shows that the Justice of the Peace investigated the death of Isaac Connolly and submitted the proceedings to the court. Though in 1864, the General Assembly no longer required these proceedings to be submitted. The report submitted to the Court of Quarter Sessions describes the circumstances of Connolly's death. In this case, Connolly passed away on August 14th, 1844, in Parksburg, when he accidentally fell from a train of cars in motion. These reports often share where the Inquisition was held, the date and cause of death, witnesses, and the date of court approval. Because these inquests were submitted to the Court of Quarter Sessions, images for these records are available under Quarter Session indictments. You can access dockets with this first link, and reports of inquests are included in our Quarter Session indictment papers. So I know Stacy and I shared quite a few records with you all today, so this is just a brief overview of what our collections include. As we mentioned earlier, births, marriages, and deaths were briefly recorded in the 1850s, but this recording stopped once the Registration Act was repealed in 1855. These life events are not again recorded by the county until the final decades of the 1800s and continue until the early 1900s. For the gaps in between, researchers may look to the many other records that Stacy and I mentioned, or you may explore our collection of coroner records. On that note, now that I have shared how deaths have been recorded in the past, I will now pass it on to Jessie Poole Gulick and Hillary Brown of the coroner's office, who will share how the coroner's office continues to operate in the present day.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hillary Brown. I'm getting our presentation here set up. I am the morgue manager. I'm accompanied here with Jessie Poole Gulick, our first deputy coroner. And as Maureen mentioned, we are going to be talking about the more modern day vital records that our office creates. I briefly wanted to go over like what our office does and what our essential duties are to our for our county. We determine the cause and manner of death to issue a death certificate. We identify the deceased. We ensure that next of kin are notified. We determine if further examination is necessary, such as an autopsy, and we handle the disposition of unclaimed decedents, usually via cremation, and we also issue cremation permits. So our office generates multiple different types of documents, including autopsy reports, death certificates, fatal demise certificates, and cremation authorizations. We're going to go down and give details about each of these different documents. Autopsy reports include descriptions of the entire exam, which include an external portion where the forensic pathologist will describe a decedent's height, weight, any identifying markers such as scars and tattoos before maybe doing a full autopsy, going into the internal examination and describing significant findings of disease and injury. Autopsy reports can sometimes also go over toxicology findings, any substances or illicit pharmaceutical or alcohol-based findings can be listed, radiology findings, and then finally list a cause of death and any contributing factors. Then we have death certificates. Maureen showed a brief photo, and I wish I'd put a full image, but we can break down a death certificate into two portions: vital statistics and medical portion. Vital statistics are going to give you the legal name of a decedent, sex, age, and race, social security number, a date of birth and death, the deceased residence with address and township, their parent information, their place of death, such as a hospital, hospice, residence, nursing home, or other place of death, a method of disposition, which is whether the person is being buried, cremated, or donated, their level of education, and their occupation and industry. Further down is the medical portion, which includes a pronouncement section for a date, time, and the pronouncing party with a license number, and whether or not the medical examiner or coroner was contacted about the death. Then we have the cause of death has two parts. Part one has an immediate cause, and then there are lines underneath for sequential due to, with approximate time intervals associated with each line. In part two, a physician or coroner can list significant conditions contributing to death. Then the manner of death is listed as one of 5 possibilities: natural, accidental, suicide, homicide, or undetermined. We also answer, was an autopsy performed? If the deceased is female, was she pregnant at any point or currently pregnant at time of death? Listed tobacco use history. If the death was due to an injury, we write the date, time, location, and give a brief description of the circumstances, and the certifier's information, signing the death certificate. And then we have a different type of death certificate called a fetal death certificate. We report and generate these death certificates for any gestational age of 16 weeks or further along. There's a lot of similarities between a traditional death certificate, but differences include a cause of death. The cause of death section has descriptions for maternal conditions, pre-listed common complications, and other significant conditions. The weight and estimated gestational age, the mother's social and medical history, including past pregnancies and prenatal care, in a collection of risk factors, delivery status and complications, and any congenital anomalies. And the most significant is there's no manner of death listed on a fetal death certificate. And then finally, a document that our office generates on a daily basis would be a cremation authorization. All funeral homes and cremation societies must submit cremation authorization requests for Chester County deaths. They submit a copy of the death certificate and fill out a form with some of the vital statistics, certifier information, and cause of death, including parts 1 and 2, and manner of death. The coroner's office reviews them and at times takes jurisdiction if there needs to be further investigation, such as a manner of death correction. For example, fall-related deaths are often marked natural when they should be accidental. Once approved, the cremation is assigned an authorization number, and the decedent can then be cremated. A brief overview of historical records. As Maureen mentioned, Archives has a lot of the information up to 1957. So Archives has records greater than 20 years old to date, such as the earliest found would be in 1720 in bound books, in the late 1800s through 1957 in paper files, and then we have 1980 to 2004 paper files with archives as well. The coroner's office retains microfiche for older cases and also paper files less than 20 years old. We have 1890 to 2000 on microfiche. No electronic system to look up most of these cases yet. So if there's an inquiry, we go by hand through the microfiche. We use an electronic case management system that has minimal information prior to the mid 2000s. We often have to sift through the microfiche, paper files, or scanned electronic files to find requested documents due to no consistent organization system over the years. But Jesse and I are working to organize those things to make things a little easier. We do have a record release policy. Records and reports not generated by the coroner's office, such as medical records, EMS, police reports, and any third-party records, are never released due to legal restrictions and HIPAA. Those third-party reports are purged from our record at least 1 year after the date of death. Then our office also follows state statutes that we legally follow for the verification of death forms being dropped off at profanatory January 31st for the previous year. Verification of death forms provide public information such as name, date of death, municipality of death, cause of death, manner of death, and the certifier. We also abide by fees such as $500 for an autopsy report, $100 for toxicology report, $50 for cremation permits. Our office does have an internal policy to provide the legal next of kin an unofficial copy of those reports for no cost, but they cannot be used for legal and insurance purposes. Then we have we're trying to organize our records and make sure that we have both physical and electronic copies of important records. We do have space limitations due to not having our own forensic facility. This hinders our organization as there are nowhere to store the files for easy access. Tossing the microfiche cases is on a case-by-case basis at this time, but we have future plans, including trying to convert those to digital files for continuity and safekeeping. We are always creating new records every day, and from signing a death certificate, performing an autopsy, or authorizing a cremation permit. And at this time, we'd like to thank you again for having us, and please list any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesse and Hillary. I appreciate your joining us and giving us a good sense of what the coroners is up to today and every day. We appreciate your service to the county. What I do have, I'm going to just put, there's one quick question about tax records. So I'm going to put a link in here. There was a question in the chat box if anyone else has other chat questions. But about the earliest tax records. So the earliest tax records start in 1715, but I put a link in the chat box for everyone to take a look. You can look at those images as well as the indexes to those. And as people start jumping off, I'm just going to put that quick feedback form, if you have a moment to complete that, we would really, really appreciate it. Are there any other questions that anyone has for any of us? We're all remaining here. Are there plans to index the tax records that are not currently indexed? Yes, we are currently working on 1801 and 1802 have been finished. We're going through and checking them and doing some quality control. Maureen is working on 1808, and I am working on 1895. And somebody says the feedback link is not working. Okay, I will put it in the email with the thing. I'm so sorry that didn't work. But yes, we are currently working. It takes a lot of work to get an index complete and up, but we have multiple indexes that we're currently working on. So stay tuned. We will post that on Facebook, just as we have when we add additional digitized resources to that images, as Maureen had shared. Oh, someone said that the link is working for them. So I will include it in the inbox, in the email that has the link to the video. So if you weren't able to complete it today, please go ahead and do that. We have a question here for, I cannot find my mother's birth certificate at the state level. Is it more possible I could find it on the county level? Depending on when that birth took place after 1906, all birth records were through the state of Pennsylvania. The county does not have anything after that. So I would go back to Harrisburg. So it's check those dates for sure. Let's see here. Any other questions?
I see one question about records relating to paupers' graves. So if there's someone who lived in the poorhouse and died in the poorhouse during their stay, I think I mentioned that one burial note sometimes that is mentioned in that record, but those go to about the early 1900s. So again, it depends on the time period that you're looking at.
I'll take the next one, Maureen. Would persons traveling through Chester County be registered for births? In the early time, so if it was from 1852 to 55 and it was taking, or one of those were, the birth took place and the doctor submitted a return, then yes. If it was the latter section of birth records that I had mentioned, that those would, from 1893, those would not be included because that was from the tax assessors. And so only people that were in that the county at that time would be listed in that register. What to bear in mind in with both of those records, and one of the reasons why the state took over, is that a lot of people were falling through the cracks, and so that they needed to make it a more standardized and uniform situation. And so that's why they did that with the Department of Vital Statistics. Let's see. Okay, I think these are, there are a couple questions here for the coroner's office. So if that's okay with you to unmute Jesse and Hillary. If someone is a stepchild, would they be considered next of kin or within that family group for an autopsy report? Or would the $500 charge apply?
Hey, this is Jessie. I think
Jessie.
it would be best for any specific case questions like that. You could just contact our main office and we could review the case to see who is a legal next of kin. Sometimes we're able to obtain permission from the legal next of kin for a different family member to obtain that unofficial report. We also are able to provide that public verification of death form that would still state the cause and manner of death. It just would not have those protected medical details that would come from a autopsy report. But we do recommend just contacting our main office, and our office manager can look through the case and see, what type of information could be provided at that point.
Yeah, and our
Perfect.
we can provide our office contact information in the chat later. And we'll
Perfect.
definitely include that information.
Fantastic. We've got someone looking for a marriage record, probably in the Quaker community. The Quakers were great record keepers, so that would be depending on the time period and what the actual Quaker meeting that your ancestor was affiliated with. I would definitely think you have a good shot of that. I would reach out. You can email us here, but there are some resources for the Quakers, particularly through the Swarthmore Consortium, that have a lot of those records. So determining what meeting it was and where those records went would be a good place to start. We have someone here asking about the poorhouse. So the Chester County Poorhouse, we have some pretty consistent and extensive records. How can you find out more about it? We may not know why. It may be but the individual records, Maureen and I highlighted just one, but there are several that would take place in order for someone to go into the poorhouse. So if, Sean, you want to reach out to us at CC Archives at chesco.org, the email from which this link was sent, or the reminder this morning, we will be able to direct you to those more specifically. And one thing we did not mention is Maureen and I are available for Ask an Archivist appointments. It is a 30-minute virtual appointment that you can register for. It's on Tuesdays. So we have 4 slots every Tuesday that are available for you. So that would be a good opportunity to talk more thoroughly through some of those more specific questions about John, the Quaker marriage record is in 1795. Yes, we do there are books that have Quaker meeting records, and include the various and sundry details per meeting. So again, determining which meeting your ancestors were potentially related or attending will help you to start that process of searching. Someone is asking about the Swarthmore College and if they're planning to digitize. I cannot speak to what their digitization priorities are or what they're choosing to digitize. I would definitely reach out. They have an extensive and a very wonderful collection. Someone says that you can find Quaker records at the DAR. And if I'll read out here, if you all would like, the coroner office phone number is 610-344-6165. I will also put that in the email that includes the link to this recording. There is no cost for Ask an Archivist. That is, we are employees of the County of Chester, so we do not charge for that. It is a 30-minute appointment to meet with us virtually. So the way it works is you go to our website, the Chester County Archives website at chesco.org. I'll put that in the chat box for everyone. And then what you can do is there is a green button that says Ask an Archivist. I'm sorry, it's a blue button that says Ask an Archivist. So let me do that. And then that will go to our the county, and then we will, the morning of the appointment sends you a link to a Teams meeting, and you'll meet with either Maureen or me. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, we appreciate all of your time, everyone sticking in with us today. As always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us here at the archives, and I'm sure the coroner's office as well. We will be getting today's video processed and then sent out as soon as it's ready for everyone. Thank you so much for attending this third Records Roundup, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.